What historical fact does no one like to talk about? During the Battle of Waterloo, one of the most prized pieces of loot was the teeth of fallen soldiers. About 200 years ago, it was actually common to use the teeth of dead people to make dentures. During the Nuremberg trials after World War II, the head of the Nazi Navy and the head of state after Hitler's death, Karl Dönitz, was charged with war crimes for using unrestricted submarine warfare and allegedly attacking unarmed civilian ships. Dönitz presented evidence that nearly all the ships he targeted were actually armed with anti-submarine weapons and radios, as well as extensive proof that the United States had committed the same actions against Japan. Because of this, those charges were dropped, and he served only 10 years in prison before being released. The Rif is the region of Morocco with the highest rate of cancer patients. Research shows that around 80% of adults and 50% of children with cancer in Morocco come from this area, which was repeatedly bombed by the Spanish Air Force with mustard gas and other chemical weapons during the independence struggle against Berber fighters from 1921 to 1927. Spain still refuses to issue an apology for this war crime, despite having signed the Geneva Convention before using these weapons on Moroccans. In the early 1900s, before World War II, more than 30 US states had laws that allowed the forced sterilization of immigrants, minorities, and people with disabilities. Hitler later commented that some of his own laws were inspired by these policies. Just look up eugenics in the United States. More recently, over 100 women in California prisons were forcibly sterilized between 2006 and 2010. That was only about 12 years ago. I'm Italian. We love to portray ourselves as victims of Nazi Germany, but we actually invented fascism. We were the first to bomb civilians with gas in Libya, 1911. We invaded Ethiopia, carried out massacres and rapes, and politically undermined the League of Nations. We sucked, and we still suck, just like every other group in the world, even though we love to say, Italiani brava gente, meaning Italians are good people. Edit. When I say we sucked and still suck, I mean we're not special, just like nobody else is. In the right conditions and the wrong situation, anyone can start ethnically cleansing someone else. I studied Italian history for a few months, and I clearly remember my teacher saying something like, Italians are historically the most anti-fascist people on earth, but historically, they're also the most fascist people on earth. I still think about that to this day whenever I read anything about Italian history. During World War II, the Japanese military kidnapped women from the Asian countries they invaded and forced those women to be sex slaves to please countless Japanese soldiers. The Japanese were also bayoneting pregnant women and children to death in the Philippines, and even the Germans told them to cool it several times. The Japanese were absolute insane psychopaths back then. Or the cannibalism of American pilots by the Japanese during World War II on the island of Chichijima. During a raid, many American dive bombers were shot down, and 9 airmen managed to bail out over the ocean. 8 of them were pulled from the water by Japanese soldiers, taken back to the island, executed one by one, and eaten. The young George Bush actually had his bomber shot down during the raid, but he managed to fly far enough away to avoid capture, probably not knowing what had happened to his fellow airmen until years later, when the soldiers were tried for their war crimes. There's a book about the incident called Flyboys, unrelated to the movie, that I hear is pretty good, though I haven't read it myself. Marcus Licinius Crassus revived decimation after a series of lost battles. He had every 10th soldier in his legions executed to boost the morale of the others. It worked. I've read that it wasn't just a soldier being executed, but that he was bludgeoned to death by the other 9, with anyone who refused forced to take the place of the next person set to die. Here's one. The Nazis were among the first major governments, if not the first, to strictly enforce animal protection laws. Hate to say it, but the Nazis also allowed families from the rural peasant class to inherit and keep their land, as long as a family member always worked it. That was way more progressive toward the rural poor than many other governments. Of course, rural Jews and other minorities lost everything. MK Ultra. Only conspiracy theorists seem to care anymore. Most Americans don't even know what it was. A brief explanation for those who don't know. MK Ultra was a top-secret CIA program in which the agency carried out hundreds of clandestine experiments, sometimes on unwitting US citizens, to explore the use of LSD and other drugs for mind control, interrogation, and psychological torture. Although Project MK Ultra ran from 1953 until around 1973, details of the illegal program didn't become public until 1975, during a congressional investigation into widespread unlawful CIA activities in the US and abroad. Doing laundry used to be hard, dull work. Very little glamour, not very interesting, and pretty smelly. The women who did it were often unfairly portrayed as whores, even though it was some of the best money they could earn. Thank God for washing machines now. I have a clear memory from when I was younger. I was really into great inventions and inventors. I asked my grandmother what she thought was the most important invention of her life of the 20th century, expecting her to say something like the airplane, the car, the moon landing, or the television. She said it was the washing machine. As a kid, I thought that was ridiculous. The TV is way cooler than a boring household item like a washing machine. Now that I'm an adult, I get it. The washing machine saved hours and hours of labor for half the population. My grandmother was a farmer with 11 children. Chances are, the washing machine has done more for women's emancipation than universal suffrage and the last 25 years of feminist writing combined. Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew and a Jewish immigrant to the US in the early 1910s, was basically the architect of modern capitalism, propaganda, media, and advertising, using his uncle's psychoanalytic studies as a foundation. Joseph Goebbels picked up Bernays' ideas on shaping public opinion and used them to craft Nazi propaganda that helped catapult them into power. To sum up, a man of Jewish heritage wrote the propaganda playbook that the Nazis used to help create the Holocaust. It's really, really unpopular to point out that advertising and propaganda are essentially the same thing. The differences in how they're used are disappearing, and it's starting to look like elites have been waging economic warfare against the masses behind the scenes for a long time now. In 1916, there was a so-called trial for a young black man named Jesse Washington. He was accused of raping and murdering his employer's wife in Waco, Texas. The jury deliberated for just 4 minutes before finding him guilty and sentencing him to death. None of his defense attorneys challenged the verdict. They remained silent. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of 10,000 to 15,000 people was waiting to lynch him. Jesse Washington was dragged from the court hearing to his torturous death. He was immediately chained, beaten, kicked, and stabbed by bystanders as he was dragged through the streets. He was skinned, dismembered, fingers, toes, limbs, and subjected to unimaginable torture. Still barely alive, the chain around his neck was thrown over a tree, and a fire was lit beneath him. Lynchers raised and lowered his body over the flames for 2 hours before he finally died. Even after death, his body was dragged through the streets of Waco. People took parts of his body as souvenirs, with some even preserving them in formaldehyde. Eventually, his body was dragged to a nearby town with a large black community and affixed to a utility pole. A constable buried him later that day. This is one of the worst examples of a public lynching in US history, a horrifying case of a community taking matters entirely into its own hands. There were many mass killings during World War II for a variety of reasons, but we mostly hear about the Germans. The Ustash movement in Croatia, supported by much of the local Catholic clergy, killed hundreds of thousands of people. Some priests were directly involved. Japan ran truly horrific death camps. Unit 731 gets mentioned sometimes, but nowhere near as much as the German camps. Japan also committed massive atrocities, like the rape of Nanking. The US, and the international community more broadly, basically allowed a completely preventable genocide of 1 million people in Rwanda. The president could have sent in the military to intervene, but he had just embarrassed himself with an operation in Somalia, so he decided his reputation and political capital were more important than 1 million innocent lives. And this wasn't some distant historical event. It happened in 1994. Nazi medicinal books are still being used to this day because they are so accurate. The most evil positive of what they did. A lot of medical advancements from their horrific experiments. It's bizarre to be both thankful and horrified for it. The Texas Revolution against Mexico was driven largely by the fact that slavery was illegal in Mexico. Remember the Alamo? That's something you almost never hear about in US history. When I learned it, I was told that Texas just sort of rebelled and the US used it as an excuse to go to war with Mexico to fulfill Manifest Destiny. Black slave owners. There were black slave owners, and quite a few of them. One of the most notorious and cruel slave owners was himself black, Nat Butler. The Pendarvis family, all black, was one of the wealthiest families in South Carolina in the 1730s. There are many more examples, but the point is, it was never taught in history class, and I didn't learn about it until well into my 30s. I wonder what kids are being taught in American history classes these days. There was a pro-democracy protest in Tiananmen Square in 1989. The Chinese Communist Party brutally suppressed it, massacred the protesters, and has since silenced nearly everything related to it. At the end of the war, in 1945, the Russians took over large parts of eastern Germany and forced Germans to leave their homes and belongings behind. Look at a map of Germany before 1939 and now. During this process, many war crimes were committed by the Red Army. It's estimated that over 2 million German women and girls were raped, leading to a massive refugee crisis and immense suffering. I'm German, and every time this topic comes up, the usual response is something like, "But what the Germans did was worse." What historical fact do you know that hardly anyone talks about? Drop it in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.